Good morning, and welcome to this, I think it's the third webinar for Rural First. My name is Chris Taylor, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about connectivity in rural areas. So I'm a Programme Manager for Shropshire Council, and I've been looking after the Connecting Shropshire programme since its inception in 2013. So the webinar today will focus very much on digital demands in a rural landscape. We'll talk a little bit about national policy and the context around that for us locally, what those interventions are and what we've been doing and what we're intending to do, why Shropshire is a particular challenge when it comes to deploying technology. I'll also talk and touch upon the 5G project that we have with West Mercia colleagues, and I'll also talk about what we intend to do going forwards. So I thought we'd touch upon, to start with really, the context of demand for digital connectivity and some statistics that hopefully you can see up on the screen. I think of interest, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 3 years. We're all using and consuming more data and in different ways. I think by the end of 2020 there were about 25 billion devices connected in the past 12 months. So the volume of devices that are starting to be connected, dishwashers, washing machines, in a domestic environment is constantly increasing and will continue to increase. And obviously we're going to talk a little bit about how perhaps some of that connectivity can be optimized within business environments, particularly around 5G technologies. 87% of adults using the internet daily, and obviously that's probably going to be increased significantly over this period where we are self-isolating through the coronavirus. I think I don't need to labour terribly on some of that Office of National Statistics data, but I think what is of interest is the volume of people that are now consuming their media over mobile devices. I think only 4% now of UK households don't have a mobile phone, and in most of those homes obviously the volume of mobile phones is probably on average around about 4, based upon obviously an average family. So on national policy, I think I wanted to touch upon really where the investment has come from and what has come through to Shropshire Council. I think we'll touch upon that in some of the forward-looking slides. So since 2013 there's been about £1.8 billion invested, particularly around superfast broadband. We're going to see an increase in that investment as we move from superfast broadband, which is 30 megabits, through to gigabit capable networks, which is now a commitment that's come from government, and we'll see the government hopes connectivity across the whole of the UK to gigabit capable broadband. I mean, the digital sector is probably worth in excess of £184 billion with its association to some of the technologies, so it is a significant growth area, and I think again the period of time that we've been self-isolating has highlighted how we've become terribly reliant on technology, digital infrastructure to communicate, do our business, etc. Positively, there are now around about 95% premises connected to superfast broadband across the UK. That was the original ambition by government. That's increased. Actually, I think that figure is probably a little bit out of date. I think that figure has actually increased to around about 96%. In Shropshire, we're around about 93 to 94%, and I'll again touch upon that in a little little bit of time on a forward-looking slide. The other policies that have happened over a period of time, Future Telecommunications Review happened in 2018. That is very much now driving the gigabit ambition. We've had a new communication code which is to help providers deploy their technology. We've had the Telecommunications Infrastructure Bill, which again is having an impact on industry, and planning reforms, which is currently halted by Ofcom, a consultation that was being undertaken on the increase of mass sizes. So our interventions since the programme began in 2013, we've invested around about £35 million worth of public funding. So that's a combination of money coming from Shropshire Council and money that we've been able to draw down from central government. It's been around about £8 million that has actually come from Shropshire Council, and that was for our first project, which was with BT Openreach. Most of the remaining funding has been from central government and has gone into, again, a contract with Openreach and another contract that we now have with Airband. So I think when you look at where we were in 2013 at 24% of premises having access to superfast, and see where we are now, you can see that that intervention has been significant. We certainly still have challenges, and we don't tend to celebrate terribly where we have had successes, because unfortunately in our business it's very much about what are you doing for me in those areas where there are gaps. So in Shropshire we've got around about 152,000 premises as of 2020, and that's increased from the figure that we had in 2013. So obviously everything that we're doing as part of intervention is then superseded by obviously additional build. So it's really important that we're not just thinking about the intervention to areas that have existed since those early procurements, but we're also thinking about what are we doing to accommodate those new build premises and ensuring that there is policy to give them good connectivity at the time that those properties are being built by the developers. So since 2013 we've connected around about 68,000 premises. The balance of premises in Shropshire has been delivered to commercially, so we have a number of commercial providers, which is a combination of obviously BT Openreach, but we also have wireless providers that have existed in Shropshire since before the programme started. So that's a combination of secure web services. Airband have had a network in Shropshire prior to our interventions, and then we've got another couple of other providers, UServe, that are based in Telford and supply into Shropshire, and we also have some new entrants into the market, which include Full Fibre that are now building in Shrewsbury, and Virgin Media have also now started to build into Shrewsbury. So across the three contracts, there's a breakdown there on the slide, and in addition to that we've got complementary projects and interventions, which include business grants, which has been running for a number of years and will extend now into the next period of phase 2, which can give businesses who currently are not in plan to get a connection from our programme. It can provide them with a opportunity to get a connection through a £25,000 grant, and that was previously superfast as the output requirement, provided that they qualified for regional development funds, but that is now gigabit capable broadband. In addition, we've got some funding that's coming from DEFRA through the Rural Development framework, and that's a £10 million project with colleagues across in Fastershire, which is a project that delivers into Gloucestershire and Herefordshire and in Telford, and that will deliver to around about 800 premises in Shropshire. In addition to that, and I've mentioned that there are a number of providers that are already benefiting from interventions that they are able to utilise through vouchers, but there's also a commercial intent from the likes of Virgin Media that currently are not relying upon those interventions. So I've got a couple of slides here now where we will focus a little bit on um, the real challenge that we have within Connecting Shropshire when it comes to deploying technology, and this is the same challenge that we have for all infrastructure in a rural county such as Shropshire. So, you know, we are the largest inland, some say the largest, some say the second largest. I think we often are challenged on that with Wiltshire, but we have a particularly large geographical footprint, and that is the main issue that we have when it comes to deploying technology. You know, we have premises across the whole of that landscape. These are not premises that are literally focused around concentrations of populace in villages. They are literally premises across the whole of the landscape. I think if you looked aerially, and we'll come on to another slide in a moment, you'll see that most areas, apart from possibly the area of outstanding natural beauty, are one of the few areas where there are very few premises, but even there are odd premises. So looking to get technology deployed across the whole of Shropshire has always been a particular unique challenge for us. You compare ourselves to the likes of Cumbria, a lot of the premises in what we would class as an equally challenged geographic area are mainly around village locations, which means it's far easier to think and consider deploying technology to a concentration of those premises. I mean, in Shropshire, I think there's around about 43% of people that actually live in around 2.5% of the area, which is the urbanised classification area. So the remaining, 97.5% of area is covered by, 57% of people. So it's a particular problem which we've been challenged with throughout, and partly why we've made decisions in awarding contracts to use a different type of technology, because literally building and digging trenches and getting cables in the ground across that scale of area is just not cost effective, or hasn't been up to this point with the money that's been available from central government. This is another slide which I touched upon a moment ago, really, which gives you the scale of the problem that we have and where our premises are. They are literally everywhere, and whilst we've built in all of those geographies in some form or another, there is always another premise just around the corner that is currently either too far from the physical network or is blocked by a tree line or a hill to get back to the wireless mast that we have actually deployed. So we have to continue to look at solutions, and those current technologies that we're using, which is a hybrid of different things, will continue to be the way that we try to address that. So we have examples at the moment in our contract with Airband where we are deploying line of sight into a village location, and then we're using fibre optic cables to distribute around those particular premises. And there will still always be an exception where we can't get or can't justify the expense of running a single fibre optic cable 3 or 4 miles up a road to a single premise, and we will have to rely upon a fixed wireless solution. So in this slide, the purpose really is to try to show you, I think, again, the challenge that we've had in Shropshire, but how well we are actually addressing some of those challenges against our peers. So if we use the Office of National Statistics rural classifications with a sample, I suppose, of our peers, you can see that Shropshire is above a lot of those peers, and particularly well above the GB national statistic for rurality. And then when you look at that compared to where we are currently with regards to getting coverage into the rural areas, we are doing pretty well. So 91.2% of premises in rural areas can currently get superfast broadband in comparison to the national average of 88.2%. And I suppose, you know, a big part of that is down to the fact that we have a number of other providers who have been looking to address the issue of connectivity in rural areas for some period of time. You know, what we've done in our intervention programs has been wonderful in getting to a number of premises quickly with public funding. But you know, if it wasn't for those other commercial providers who have been delivering and continue to deliver and have aspirations to continue to build into rural areas, then you know, we would be left with an even greater challenge like some of our peers. So you know, a lot of the work that we've done in our project has been great, but it's certainly complemented by the fact that there is a commercial appetite within a rural county to address the problem of connectivity, and I don't think we should forget that particular point. The other statistic that I've just included in that slide really is just demonstrating again the sheer exponential growth in costs associated to building the network. So in our first contract that we had with Openreach, you know, we were paying around about £310 per premise, public funding. And the reason that cost was relatively low was because we were actually building from existing points of presence in areas where there was a concentration of premises. As we moved into our second contract and it became more challenging to get into the rural areas, that figure increased significantly to the point, you know, that it's fourfold of our first contract. The reason our third contract, the price has come down again, is because we've used a different technology. But what I would say with regards to that average price, that was at the point where we contracted with a full fixed wireless solution. Now we've just recently made a change to our contract where we're bringing in a rural optic solution from Airband, which is what I mentioned before, where we will bring in the wireless into a location where we will then distribute fibre optic cables, and that £888 figure per wireless connection will certainly increase for the rural optic solutions that we are deploying and will continue to deploy up until the end of our contract in 2021. So this next slide is a slide that we've taken from Think Broadband, and Think Broadband is a source of information used by the provider market, but also authorities such as Shropshire to compare where they are impartially against their peers. So this is not data that we collate and share, this is data that is picked up by industry, Think Broadband, which is an impartial source that we use and think gives us, I think, the most relevant statistical element for the program. So you can see, and we've talked about up to this point the coverage figure of around about 93 to 94%. So 93.7% superfast coverage is the figure that they're currently reporting. That's with around about 6% having full fibre deployed. So we did quite a bit of deployment in our first contract and a very little bit in our second contract. Most of the work that we've done with Openreach has been what we call fibre to the cabinet. So this is where cabinets, full fibre cabinets are taken into geographic locations, and we still rely upon the copper cable that takes the signal back to the home. So the limitations in that technology is that if you're too far away from that box or down the copper line, you will be restricted on the speed that you can potentially get. And And that's really why industry has started to look very much at deploying full fibre to take away that particular weakness. And the future telecommunications infrastructure review very much talked about removing all copper cabling by 2025, and that remains the government's ambition. I personally have a view that 2025 is it was challenging before where we are today with COVID, but even without COVID, 2025 is extremely ambitious to connect all premises, bearing in mind that the national position is only 12.5% currently, and we still need to wait for some approval for state aid funding to intervene with the figure of £5 billion that the government's talked about. So 2033 was the original date put in the Future Telecommunications Infrastructure Review. I still think that was quite challenging, so we'll have to see where we are when we come out of the current crisis. I think what's interesting for Shropshire, provisional views that I have is, we could probably see some commercial coverage in the more urbanised areas, our market towns. You could see that happening potentially, although Openreach up to this point haven't committed to the likes of Shrewsbury, although we have obviously competition that's now moved in from Full Fibre and Virgin Media, as I mentioned before. We still think that there'd be around about 65,000 premises across the whole of Shropshire that may not be commercially viable. So, the £5 billion is all about getting to the final 20%, and we think there would potentially be around about 65,000 premises in Shropshire that may fall into that final UK 20% figure. So when you add that up, start doing some calculations, potentially that could be anything between 70 to 100 million pounds that Shropshire would need alone to address that market failure. So, we're certainly waiting to find out how the model that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport will address that particular gap area. So on to mobile coverage, and I think the headline is that Shropshire Council is not directly responsible for mobile phone coverage. It never has been responsible for it. We had some slight involvement in a side project that was run by the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, which was called the Mobile Infrastructure Project, and that had an aim to deliver connectivity into some of the not-so-hot areas by building masts that needed to be shared by all of the 4 mobile network operators. Disappointingly, it didn't build a significant number of masts nationally, and there were none in Shropshire, and the project was eventually decommissioned. So it's interesting to hear that there is now some plans which I'll touch upon around the shared rural network, but the headlines around 4G coverage, we are well below, in my view, where we should be, and that is predominantly down to the commercial providers not delivering into the more rural areas. We have reasonable coverage, I think everybody would agree, in some of the more urbanised areas, but certainly when you are on the roads and getting into the more rural areas, that's where the challenge is, and government has been trying to address that, and we as Shropshire Council regularly lobby in to Ofcom, and certainly the Department of Culture, Media and Sport about some of the issues associated to mobile coverage, because we know how important it is for communities and business to have good mobile coverage. So frustratingly, Shropshire around about 59% 4G coverage to premises indoor, and the coverage in a rural context is around about 68%. So outdoor coverage we fare reasonably better. The reason it's lower in premises is because of the issue of signals penetrating through walls to get into homes. So you would expect an outdoor coverage percentage to be better, but we still feel that there is far more work that needs to be done in this particular area, and I think there's a balance to be had in making that case to government, at the same time of asking for better coverage. There has to be a recognition, if you want better coverage, then you've got to be prepared to have more masts in the countryside. So it's something that is often a challenge, and we had that certainly in a number of areas, building a network with airband where we wanted to build masts, but obviously some residents didn't want to see that, and at the same time these are the same residents and communities that complain to us about poor coverage. So, you know, in the world that we're growing into with the need for digital communications, we have to accept that there has to be some give and take. So the shared rural network is an investment that the government's recently made. It's around about £500 million that the government's putting into this, and 500 million is coming from industry. So the providers, of which, you know, Telefonica, which is O2, EE, Vodafone and Three are the four main mobile network operators. Most of the other services that you often see, whether it's Tesco Mobile or any other brands, are normally white label products and services off those existing networks. You know, they're not separate networks as such. So the shared services network is all about trying to improve coverage and making commitments to government to improve that coverage across the whole of Shropshire. So the intention is that at least one operator will provide 95% 4G coverage across the landmass of the UK by 2026, and individually each operator will aim to get to 90% geographic coverage, which will result in about 84% of the UK having a 4G coverage from all of those four operators. And that's a significant increase, because at the moment that's only about 66% in 2020. So lots more work to be done, and certainly Shropshire Council intends to continue to make sure some of that activity happens. I mean, we had a meeting last year with EE, identified a number of issues associated to network coverage, which they are currently addressing, and we will hold them to account on addressing those particular issues. We'll do a similar piece of work with Vodafone, and we intend to do the same with O2 and Three. So, you know, that is where the council's involvement is, holding providers to account, but we are not directly responsible. These are commercial operations. The responsibility really sits with Ofcom, and I think on that particular point we have on a number of occasions challenged Ofcom, because we don't believe that the providers provide accurate projections, which is then put into the public domain with regards to what the coverage is, and then sets expectations, and we think more needs to be done on some of the testing that Ofcom undertake, and we'll continue again to make that case to Ofcom. So I wanted to come on to obviously a matter which has had a little bit of publicity nationally and locally, which is 5G technology. So a project that we as Shropshire Council are now involved in with colleagues from University of Chester, University of Worcester, the company Three, the network operator Three, Herefordshire and Worcestershire CCG, the West Midlands Academic Health Science Network, NHS, and Airband, who obviously we currently already have a contract with, and we submitted a bid into the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport as part of their 5G programme. They were looking to have bids in from projects and consortiums who had ideas of testing the 5G technology in a rural environment, and that was part of their Rural Connected Communities project, and this is a sister project to the Urban Connected Communities project, which is currently in operation in the West Midlands area through the West Midlands Combined Authority, and we've certainly been working closely with West Midlands Combined Authority about how they've been applying some of that funding into a number of work streams, and I think on another one of these webinars my colleagues from West Midlands Combined Authority will be talking to you in a little bit more detail of what's happening within their urbanised programme. So the Rural Connected Communities programme is very much about testing what 5G can look like in a rural environment. It's about trying to see whether or not there is a long-term business model. So we certainly have a number of ideas to undertake case studies to see what 5G can deliver in a particular rural environment, what 5G may deliver in the future we don't actually know yet. There are a number of opportunities with connected devices that I think is currently within the public domain, of ideas around autonomous vehicles, machine-to-machine connectivity, agri-tech, driverless tractors, etc. But the project that we're looking to deploy, particularly for the rural connected communities, is around a number of themes, and that's really looking at how you can deploy the technology using existing infrastructure, and looking really at the assistive healthcare opportunities that 5G technologies can actually bring in a rural setting. So I think I touched upon in the previous slide the key outcomes that we are trying to demonstrate to government, because the programme is all about looking at small trials and research that can then be used by government to scale up deployment nationally. So this isn't about providing immediate ubiquitous 5G coverage across Shropshire. It's a focused trial in a particular geography with partners across the borders of Worcestershire, and we want to see how we can, in the first case, try to reuse the assets that we've already built with government funding through the Airband contract, and potentially use other public assets, whether that's buildings, to deploy the 5G technologies. But we also want to see, from a health and care aspect, how we can maybe deliver those models in a different way. So we're very much looking at in-home care, and possibly in home care we mean both within the residential premise, but also potentially in a care home environment or a small cottage hospital. So that may be doing consultations, video consultations, or that may be using a number of connected devices that will alert the centre as to unusual activity of a vulnerable individual at home. So we're currently in the very early stages of bringing some of that intelligence around case studies together. What we need to be sure is that we can have case studies that are applicable to testing 5G technologies and demonstrate the need for 5G technologies. And 5G will deliver, low latency, high bandwidth, instant access to services. So we need to really be sure that what we are testing in these case studies demands that technology requirement. So we're working now with partners on what those case studies potentially will look like, and we're also at the current stage of looking where the assets are that we can enable in order to use the 5G network across that particular geography. So I touched upon it previously. The geography we're looking to test is across the Shropshire and Worcestershire borders. We've identified approximately 13 sites that we think are potentials. We will reduce that down to approximately 5, and the suppliers, the technology suppliers, will obviously be ensuring that the sites that are chosen will be able to provide a network of connectivity for our case studies. So the two are hand in glove. We need to make sure that where we build the network, we can also run our case studies. We will be limited on the number of sites for those case studies, so we'll be having around about 100 separate licenses from our providers for 5G, and that will need to be carefully thought through as to where we will get the most optimum output for those test and research facilities. So the project will start from the 1st of April, or has started I should say, and it will run for a 2-year period, so we don't expect that network and case study work probably to be in full swing probably until the latter part of this year, and obviously we need to see again what the impacts on that timescale are from the current crisis that we're living through. So this slide I think is really probably embellishing what I've just provided you with as an update. I think probably the first points under the network business case are particularly appropriate because you know, for network providers to build networks in rural areas, there has to be a commercial case for them. There has to be a viable outcome for them to justify their investment. So when we think about 5G, we need to really start thinking about what is it that will demand us all to start using the technology, which will then drive the revenue streams back in for those providers. And there has to be something above and beyond what currently is being provided to us, because if there isn't something that we all suddenly need and want to use, then the same argument may well be there that exists for mobile coverage. There isn't a commercial case to be answered, and government at this moment in time obviously is already challenged with regards to intervening in the likes of broadband. So, you know, whilst the two do go very closely together, broadband and 5G technologies, we have to accept that we want a market to exist in the UK as a whole to deliver mobile connectivity and 5G connectivity. So I'm sure as we move forward through this decade that there will be new innovative ideas that will come forward from technologists and developers that will, in the same way that we're all using video conferencing now while we're at home, that there may well be a demand for a technology that we need that will require 5G and which will demonstrate to the provider market that they need to build these networks. I think on the health case, health business case, I think that case has been well made for a period of time, and hence why we are choosing that particular area of focus for our initial case studies. I think on their test and the trial 5G user cases beyond the healthcare, I think that there will be some opportunities, and we've got some very interesting discussions that we've been having again with colleagues from Midlands Connect, the West Midlands area, around transportation and exchange hubs, and whether there's some opportunities perhaps to trial some sites which offer a range of different services to communities in rural areas. So again, we will start to look at that as the 5G project moves forward. So I just wanted to come on to my final slide and just summarise really from our perspective at Shropshire Council where things are from a national and local position. Gigabit capable broadband, I've mentioned a couple of dates, 2025, 2033 and £5 billion. I think we are waiting. We're plugged into conversations with the local government association. I sit on a digital connectivity working group which is working very closely with Broadband Delivery UK, sorry, keep saying Broadband Delivery, Building Digital UK as they've been renamed, and that's very much to look at how that £5 billion will flow down to local authorities and how that modelling works with regards to where the gaps are. I think there's certainly an ongoing discussion with government about a policy nationally, certainly with new builds, to ensure that there is gigabit capable broadband being deployed in all new builds, and I think there will need to be potentially, to meet that 2033 timescale, changes around the likes of highways legislation in order that the providers can actually build at speed. That may be controversial, but I think there will absolutely be a demand coming from industry in order that they can actually deploy expediently. 2025 copper removal, I think that's again very ambitious. Openreach obviously own the telecommunications network. We'll see a proportion, obviously, of people migrating across to what they call voice over IP technologies, which runs over the internet, and obviously lots of us use that now when we're at work, remote conferencing, etc. But obviously domestically, urbanised areas with a demographic of more aged individuals transferring to a different way of talking to family and friends will certainly be more of a challenge that needs to be considered. Mentioned the shared rural network. I think we need to obviously keep very close to that to understand how that's going to improve mobile coverage, and 5G, my last few slides, is certainly an area that we're watching with interest, and I think it's wonderful that we are included as an early project to certainly see what the opportunities will be around that.